All right, good afternoon. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Institute of World Politics. For those of you who are new, IWP is a graduate school of national security and international affairs. We have 5 master's degree programs, 18 certificates of study, and a new doctoral program. We also offer the opportunity to take a single course without having to pay an entire semester's worth of tuition cost. One can also audit such a course at a much less cost. If you're interested in learning more about us, please feel free to speak to one of our staff at the conclusion of this event. Ms. Maria Juczewska is a communication specialist with versatile international experience. Her education in linguistics, culture studies, and international affairs, combined with years of living abroad, makes her point of view unique and comprehensive. Ms. Juczewska has worked for the Kościuszko Chair of Polish Studies since 2014, where she serves as Associate Director. In her scholarly work, she is specifically interested in propaganda. Please join me in welcoming our speaker.
Ladies and gentlemen, it is a great pleasure to talk to you today. This is a very important week for all the Poles around the world, because this week befalls the 80th anniversary of the deportations of the Poles to Siberia during the Second World War. This is an important thing to talk about, in my opinion, because we tend to focus on many atrocities of World War II that were taking place in Europe, but we often forget about people who were deported to the European parts of Russia, but also beyond the Urals to the Asian part of Russia. And many of them didn't survive this operation of relocation. And I think that at least what we owe them is to remember about them, what they have been through, and to simply remember that beyond the comfort of peaceful times of our own time, there might also happen a different time. And I think it's very important to remember so that we can be wary and avoid similar happenings in the future. First of all, I need to come back a little bit to history of Europe and to the eve of the Second World War, because the whole tragedy of Polish deportations started with Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, signed on August 23, 1939. This pact included a secret clause which established the modus operandi between the Soviets and the Germans after a possible dismemberment of Poland. It read, "In the event of a territorial and political rearrangement of the areas belonging to the Polish state, the spheres of influence of Germany and the USSR shall be bounded approximately by the line of the rivers Narew, Vistula, and San. The question of whether the interests of both parties make desirable the maintenance of an independent Polish state and how such a state should be bounded can only be definitely determined in the course of further political developments. In any event, both governments will resolve this question by means of a friendly agreement." So even before the World War II started, the fate of Poles inhabiting Poland was partly decided. Here we can see in the right bottom corner, you can see the signatures under the secret clauses that sealed fates of more than 6 million Poles. And indeed, the German attack on Poland took place on September 1st, 1939. Poles were completely unprepared for the attack conducted by way of blitzkrieg, which was an innovation in military technique, and they were very quickly conquered. When the Polish army was in the middle of regrouping, hoping to move farther away from the western border and to be able to regroup and face the Germans, they were attacked on September 17th by the Soviets. The attack on Poland of the USSR was prompted partly by the inactivity of Polish allies, the Britain and France, who, even though they formally in line with the alliance signed with Poland, who on 3rd September declared war on Germany, they nevertheless failed to intervene in any military way. So the Soviets knew they had a free hand in Poland, and they complied with the secret clause of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact. Here you can see a joint Soviet and German military parade in Brest-Litovsk on September 22nd. This is very interesting to see the pictures from the parade, because at times it is claimed that this parade has never happened, but luckily internet has a long memory and photos of nearly everything can be found. So as you can see on the map, Poland was partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. The western part of Poland was divided into two zones. The part in uniform brown was incorporated to Third Reich, while the striped part was to remain a German protectorate in occupied Europe. It was called General Government, and it had a bit different conditions of treatment for the Poles. However, in both formerly Polish parts, the conditions for the Polish populace were miserable. However, we're not going to discuss this now. We're going to focus on a less known part, the Soviet part, which was governed in a bit different way. In the Soviet occupied zone, the Soviets were doing their best to keep the semblance of legality of what they were doing. So officially, they were not attacking Poland. Officially, they came to the rescue of the peoples of Western Belarusia and Western Ukraine, who, in face of the collapse of the Polish state, were helpless. So they required help from the brotherly Soviet Union to keep their safety and to ensure the administrative structure of the collapsed Polish state. So the Soviets made sure that it looks as if they were coming to the rescue. For this reason, the changes that they were introducing in their part were more gradual than the changes that were taking place in the German occupied part, and they were more gradual. So the Poles at the beginning were confused about the aim of why the Soviets were coming, because it was not at all clear whether they're coming as allies to help Poles against the Germans. There was a lot of Russian propaganda saying that actually the Soviet troops are not invading, they're coming to the help of the Poles. Meanwhile, the propaganda circulated in other languages than Polish called on the local ethnic minorities to raise against the Polish lords, in line with the concept of class struggle that the Soviets wanted to inflame in that region. On October 22nd, 1939, both in Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, a plebiscite was held. The aim of the plebiscite was to choose the Polish representatives to the national assemblies of those regions of Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, who were subsequently to vote in order to decide whether they are going to join the Soviet Union or not. And naturally, when such a voting took place, such a voting of representatives took finally place in November, on November 1st and 2nd in Moscow, the people who were the representatives of Western Ukraine and Western Belarus in line with the plebiscite, they voted for those parts, those former parts of Poland joining USSR. So on top of, on the veneer, it all looked legal. Well, there used to be Poland, now it's occupied. The people chose their representatives, and the representatives decided that they do want their lands to belong to the Soviet Union. And lo and behold, this is how Poles who used to inhabit those lands became the citizens of the Soviet Union. Naturally, the situation of that part of Poland was a little more complex than of the western part, because there were many ethnic minorities inhabiting that part of Poland. Of course, nationality is a modern concept, so I will not get into that now. Nevertheless, it needs to be said that in that part of Poland, which constitute almost half of Polish territory, the Poles were not a domineering group. Other groups such as Belarusians and Ukrainians were also numerous. The Soviets, when overtaking those lands, faced a possibility of introducing revolutionary struggle through inflaming ethnic differences, and this is precisely what they did. From the very beginning of the Soviet rule in that part, Polish elites, because Poles were most ethnically conscious for the longest time in that area, and they often formed intellectual elites, as well as landed elites. So the Poles were being arrested, notably the members of not only of the military forces, but also of the forces that used to defend the border in that part, as well as landowners. We have memoirs of landowners from that area who remember that they had their former, how to put it, they used to own villages, so the people from villages were coming to them to see them in, for instance, Lviv, to ask what they are supposed to do if the Soviets come and collect information on whether the villagers were treated well or not by their landlord. So the landlord in question, Princess Lanskoroyska, said that they just have to say the truth. So she got stellar reviews from her villagers, and this is how she found herself on the proscription list for deportation, because she got such a stellar review that obviously her behavior was completely against the popular propaganda about the Polish lords exploiting the Polish peasants and peasants of all other ethnicities. So increasingly, ever since September, ever since September 17, 1939, the terror in the Soviet-occupied zone was increasing, but it was happening gradually. The arrests were not taking place right away. They took place after a few months. People were not, initially people were not taken away in large groups, only here and there, and of course men had to hide. But suddenly, in February 1940, the operation of mass deportation was organized, and they came, and on that one night, they deported hundreds of thousands of people from the eastern part of Poland. What also needs to be mentioned here is the Katyn forest massacre. It's a major element important at the beginning of the Second World War. Namely, the Soviets captured Polish officers who became the prisoners of war. And suddenly they were arrested. They were taken to 3 prisoners' camps in Starobielsk, Ostaszków, and Kozielsk. The conditions were fine. Their families were allowed to send them packages and letters. The letters came back, and suddenly nobody heard from them. The letters stopped coming. Nobody could locate the officers, and the fate of approximately 22,000 Polish POWs was a bone of contention in the contacts between Poland and Russia, even after Russia became the ally of the United States and Great Britain, and by virtue of fate, the ally of our allies as far as Poland is concerned. So the fate of the POWs was a burning issue, and it also influenced the fate of the deported families, but I will talk about that later. The picture you can see here is the picture from exhumation of the Polish POWs, whose fate became more clear later on in the course of the war, but we will talk about it later. So as far as the total number of deported is concerned, it is very difficult to estimate this number. According to the lowest possible estimate, it is about 300,000 and 340,000 people. But this data is only compiled on the basis of the documents of railroad and KVD records. So possibly this is only a part of all the records on all the deported people. Higher estimations were conducted by the émigré milieus here in America and in Great Britain after the war. The way they were estimating the number of the deported was they were either counting the number of people per carriage and estimating how many carriages there could be in a given transport, or they were relying on the information of friends and kin who were reporting here and there on who was taken where and how. So the number of people deported remains an open question until today, and establishing it correctly would require a lot of field research also in the area of the former USSR. So this is a topic of research that is very time-consuming and can possibly take years to establish. And of course, the willingness of state powers, state authorities to cooperate with Polish authorities. So this is a more sophisticated question, especially now that the USSR is no longer there and there's no central authority who could say yes or no to research. The map I have here, which cites the possible number of people deported, comes from a source from the 1980s, which I consider fairly persuading. So it gives the total number of approximately 900,000 people deported. Yes?
Actually, a map from 1943 from the Polish government
Well, of course, but my source was from
I mean, it was published in your source.
yeah,
That's
yeah,
how I see it.
yeah, precisely.
Otherwise, it sounds like this map is from back in
Yeah, you're right. Of course, Professor Chodakiewicz is the expert.
It's important for methodology. Sorry,
Yeah.
Very important.
So there were 4 waves of deportations, and we have the anniversary of the first deportation this week, and this was definitely the most unexpected event in the lives of those people. On top of that, it was taking place in horrible weather conditions because the temperatures at that point were at minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's a low temperature even for a regular train road, not necessarily one in a cattle carriage. So the subsequent waves of deportations were meant at taking away from the former Polish lands all the people who could become the source of opposition to the new Soviet power or the source of preservation of the Polish culture in those lands. So these were not only men who were breadwinners of the families, of course apart from the men who were arrested earlier, but also women, elderly people, and small children. In fact, the percentage of children arrested, at least in that first wave of deportation, was approximately 44%. And those children are partly the reason for this presentation, because I think that what happened to them, if they survived, having to remember all those traumas is unimaginable to us nowadays. We live in such a sheltered reality, and our everyday problems of the internet age are so far removed from the tragedy of all those people that I just wanted to mention them at least and to talk about their fate. So those people were mostly families of Polish foresters, Polish military and civilian settlers, and from memoirs, we also know that they at least partly were landowners. They were deported to northern Russia, Komi Republic, and western Siberia beyond the Urals. On April 13, we had further wave of deportations. This time the families of Katyn forest massacre were deported. And this is worth mentioning because the way the addresses of those families were assembled was particularly clever. And namely, the only reason why the Polish officers interned in those 3 camps were allowed to write home was to collect the addresses to which they were writing, to make sure that all their families are taken care of. What is interesting, the order to deport the Poles to the east was given in December 1939. Meanwhile, the definite decision to dispose of the 22,000 Polish POWs from the internment camps was taken only in March 1940. So those people, even if that decision was not taken and by some miracle they would have returned home, they would have returned to an empty home, because all their wives, all their children, or all their elderly parents would have been already away far beyond the Soviet western border. On April 13, the families of Katyn forest massacre victims and the so-called socially dangerous elements were deported, and almost entirely to Kazakhstan. So the socially dangerous elements are any people who are either financially independent enough or intellectually independent enough to oppose the Soviet power. On the night of 28 to 29 June 1940, another wave of deportations deported people who were not initially the inhabitants of the area occupied by the Soviets. They were the refugees, so from the German occupied part, because when Poland was divided between Germany and the USSR, a part of Polish citizens decided to seek refuge in the Russian part, and many of them were Jews. And on May and June 1941, another wave of deportation took place. It was the cleansing of border lands and of the Baltic regions, so Poles were deported from that parts farther to the east of the USSR, and this deportation was taking place in particularly dramatic conditions because in the meantime the German-Soviet war broke out, so all the trains moving eastwards were being bombed. So if an echelon is a line of cattle carriages, transporting Polish deportees was incidentally put on fire, nobody was making any effort to put the fire out. They would just disentangle the carriage and let the people inside burn. And the carriages were closed from the outside with barbed wire, so people who were inside couldn't go out. The conditions of arrest and deportation can be seen here. A part of my inspiration comes from the book War Through Children's Eyes, and this book presents the accounts of the conditions in the deported places in the letters of children who were written after they were evacuated from the Soviet Union. And this is a drawing of a boy who was at the time 12 from Stanisławów, which describes how the Bolsheviks were chasing away the people who were trying to approach the carriages containing the deportees. Because what was happening was that the conditions in February were terrible. It was very frosty, and this was to the misery of the Polish inmates also in concentration camps in the German part of the occupied Poland. But the people who were arrested didn't expect it at all, because the subsequent waves of deportees, they kind of knew that this might be coming for them, so people were more prepared than this first wave. And the arrests would typically take place early in the morning, so around 4 a.m. So this is the moment when you are woken up in the middle of your sleep, you don't expect anything, you are the most discombobulated, and this was done on purpose. People were given between 15 minutes and 2 hours to pack up, but typically it was between 15 and 30 minutes. And oftentimes they were not informed where they were going, they were just told to pack up. So it only depended on the benevolence of the people who were arresting them, whether they are going to take the winter clothing or not, whether they're going to take food or not. Usually the most precious family possessions were confiscated by the people who came to do the arrest, and this is preserved in those children's memories, how usually there's a group, one political commissar and 2 NKVD soldiers coming, telling people to wake up, searching the house for alleged weapons. People are held at gunpoint for 2 hours, and then they're given 15-30 minutes to pack. and they are loaded on cattle cars usually and transported to the point of where all the people were supposed to meet before being loaded on the cattle trains. Oh no, come back.
Right.
Okay. So here we come to the question of the number of people deported, because officially when the rules for the deportation were written down on paper, there was supposed to be no more than 25 people per carriage. Each of them was supposed to receive 800 grams of bread and a warm soup once per day. There was also supposed to be a carriage with medical provisions and medical care, and water for everybody to travel. In reality, the carriages were overcrowded. When you go through the accounts of children, rarely do you encounter 25. More likely, they mention 50, more than 50, up to 70 people per carriage. So this is completely overcrowded, very primitive. There is no water or food, one outlet in the floor to relieve yourself. If people were better organized, they would improvise some cover from a blanket or from whatever else they could to shield this space. However, most of them were insufficiently equipped for this voyage, so blankets were far more valuable than to provide cover for this kind of relief. So we have this terrible overcrowding, infestation with lice and other vermin, not enough water to go around. So people, if they of course were allowed, they would try to scoop snow from the rooftop of the carriage and melt it and they have at least a tiny bit of water to drink. If somebody died on the road, which was not infrequent, the train was not stopping, so what they could do with the cadavers was just wait until the next stop. And of course, the first victims of such voyage are infants, children, and elderly. What was especially painful as a memory to many people was children asking for water, because there was just not enough and children couldn't understand it. And of course, it's hard to imagine how mothers with infants felt knowing that the infants are dying of hunger. So this is how this was happening for the first wave of deportees. Again, the memories of Princess Lanskorońska mention that people, when they were closed in those cars and waiting for deportation, because sometimes they would wait in the railway station for days, and still people who were trying to approach the carriages and give the people inside some bread or some water or whatever other possession were chased away. There's one dramatic account of a mother who managed to pass her infant through the window to her mother waiting outside, and unfortunately the grandmother was spotted and she had to give the infant back. So this is what this was like for the Poles. They were singing religious hymns. It was already Lent, so they were singing Gorzkie Żale, which is like a devotional Polish song remembering the Passion of Christ. So this is how they felt, and this is where they traveled. Depending on the place of deportation, they faced difficulties related to either very severe continental climate, especially in the northern parts, or the heat climate of the Russian steppes, which was especially painful in Kazakhstan, where 40% of the total number of deportees found themselves. So you can see in this map, the striped places indicate the places of deportation. The red spots indicate the Gulag prisons. However, when we're talking about the civilian population, they mostly were deported to the places of labor, but not to prison camps. It was mostly men who found themselves in Gulag. Meanwhile, the families with women and small children were sent to those Soviet republics, which were not very popular with Soviet themselves because of the hard living conditions, and they were just dumped in the middle of nowhere and redistributed in the surrounding countryside to just join whoever conducted the miserable existence there and to work with them. There are many sources available in Polish about the experiences.
Can you go back to the...
Yes, sure.
What's the name of this area?
It's Yakutia, the lagers of Yakutia.
Oh,
All right. So in Polish, there's plenty of literature containing the memories from those times available. But one of the names, the Inhuman Land, which is also a title of the book, is let's say the nickname for the areas of Russia and for generally the experience of the deported people in those times. So here you can see what the railway carriage transporting people for 2, 3, or 4 weeks in the middle of winter looked like. On the left side you see children with a piece of bread. Then you see the people inside of the train, who, as you can see, are predominantly women and children. And here you can see 2 girls peeping out of the window to just double check where they are. Sometimes the closing of the windows was enforced, so they couldn't even look out and take a breath. Of course, there were different difficulties on the road, apart from starvation and vermin and horrible hygienic conditions. And also, the external temperature was either freezing cold or boiling, hot, depending on the season of the year in which the deportation was taking place. In either case, the casualties followed. So here we also have to imagine that this is people who were deported were the culture creating stratum of Polish society. So these were usually people not used to hard physical labor. And even if among them were also the so-called rich peasants, or foresters or colonizers, those were still people who did not experience the primitive conditions of human existence that were widespread at that point in the Soviet Union. So I always think about women who just find themselves suddenly in the middle of a steppe or in the forest where snow is high to your waist, and you have possibly 2, 3, 4 kids with you, and maybe even an elderly mother, and you are the only person in the age which allows to work, which means you are the only person who gets the food rations. So what do you do? And this nickname, the Inhuman Land, is interesting because now we live in, again, I was saying this before, but to me it's very interesting how sheltered become the conditions of our life and how harsh the conditions of their life were. So there were different difficulties depending on the climate in a given part. Some claim that the harsh conditions in the northern parts of Russia were better because at least people were spared the rampant diseases which were happening in definitely warmer climate of the steppe. However, in Kazakhstan, in turn, the amplitude of temperatures can be very large. So you can have a very frosty night and a very hot day. So it's hard to say whether you prefer to have it frosty all year or just frosty at night. All in all, when we hear deportations, we rarely think about what it entails, and I wanted to focus in this lecture on what it really entailed. It entailed facing not only a completely different way of existence in terms of sophistication, but also the most basic adversities of nature, such as climate, about which we no longer think. But when you are told to pack within 15 minutes and nobody tells you the destination, you find yourself suddenly in a climate for which you are completely unprepared. As a rule, the Polish deportees were just distributed among the villages, and they were dealing with the trades that were appropriate for a given area, whether this was working with timber or joining a fish harvesting collective, or joining farmers in the steppe, or joining some villages close to the industrial centers where people worked. Poles were simply joining the Soviets in their daily life. Oftentimes Poles were met with hostility of the local people, who didn't quite differentiate between the Russians and the Poles, and saw Polish people as just another type of the oppressive Soviet power who was taking their food away and their men and boys to the army. Accounts differ because it very much depended on the circumstances in the area, but in general the attitude of the local people towards the Polish deportees was not very favorable. Then we have this rule: who doesn't work doesn't eat. In many places people were not working in exchange for money, they were working in exchange for food ratios. So you had to fulfill your work quota, which at times was ridiculous. For instance, I remember from memories of one of the girls who was unfortunately left with the role of the breadwinner for her household because her mom was too old to work and she had 3 siblings. She was working in some wool producing factory, and the daily quota of the of the initial product from the sheep that you have to put through the industrial process of carrying was 7 tons of wool to carry for a woman per day in steel baskets. So these are the working conditions that they were faced with, and she's only 15 and she's writing, well, she had to do that and she doubled in almost everything else to just sustain her family. Then there is another problem related to work. Most of this work was done in very primitive conditions. So there was a lot of casualties due to inadequate tools or accidents at work, especially when logging timber is concerned. And here we have also a problematic situation of children, because Anybody above the age of 16 was not considered a child. People between 14 and 16 year of age, sometimes even between 12 and 16, were considered good for work, for a bit less strenuous jobs, but they would still have to leave early in the morning and come back late at night to work in the woods in the temperature of -20, -30 degrees Fahrenheit. They were not adequately dressed. They had to improvise on the spot, and no wonder that half of them was actually dead before the end of 1941. They had insufficient food, and this was due not only let's say that the reasons were twofold. At times it was really the ill will of the person who was the administrator of the village, so he didn't really bother about the Poles, so he wouldn't bother about their food ratios. But overall, the food provision in the Soviet Union during the war was not sufficient even for the locals. So there are many memories of people related to what they were forced to eat, and how people, even though they were abhorred by the things that they ate, they would still eat leftovers from the bins, rats, cats, dogs, small birds. Of course, they had to be very entrepreneurial in terms of finding food, because the feeling of hunger was probably one of the most frequent feelings described by the children, and the feeling which appears in every account. So sometimes nature would come to their help, and people would supplement their diet with whatever they could find in the forest, and you can find different berries and mushroom, and you can even hunt in the forest during the summer. Another important element of the diet were the needles of the pines, which were collected and dried, because in winter a tea made of those needles was a source of vitamin C, which helped to battle the deficiency of vitamin C, which led to diseases. And of course, there were disastrous hygienic conditions related to the primitive lifestyle, but also in generally to the low culture of the area. And the overall desperate condition. Lack of hygiene and how painful this is was also an element of children's accounts, as well as rampant diseases related to also lack of appropriate medication and medication facilities, or you are reading a blood-curdling accounts of how a sick person had to go 30 kilometers to hospital. So no wonder the survival rate was not high.
Question.
Yeah.
So, under such dire circumstances, are there any documented cases of cannibalism? And
there are mentions in the accounts, which I read specifically for the purpose of this lecture, which focuses on children. There are mentions of children who write that they left place X and Y, and that they were afraid to go to the station because they heard about cannibals living in the area. But I haven't read any systematic account regarding cannibalism in regards to the sojourn of the Polish deportees in the areas of the Soviet Union. I wanted to read two brief accounts just to give you an idea of what it felt and what it was like, which are taken from children's children's essays that were written for at the request of their teachers once they have left the Soviet Union or evacuated from the Soviet Union. What I also found interesting was the irony which transpired in many of those accounts, even though these must have been the essays of 15-year-old children the moment they were written. So at the moment they were experiencing that, they were maybe 12 and 13, and still they were able to perceive the irony of the fate. So the first one reads, it was very hard to get bread. There were such lines that you had to get in line at night to get a kilo of bread. Mama and my sister was 3 days away, and she began to come back, and the road was hard, the nights cold, they had to sleep on the step. There were no houses there, wasn't even a place to hide from the rain. But again, at noon it was hot, so their clothes smoked from the sun. They didn't have anything to drink because the bottle broke and the water poured out. They came home at night tired and ragged. They didn't have a place to lie down because there were no beds, only clay stoves, so they slept on that. There were very many flea beetles, fleas and ants because there was no tub, so you could wash somewhere. And most of all, there wasn't any soap. That's how it was in our kolkhoz, in that Russian paradise, without bread, without clothes, without soap. And the other excerpt. When mother was bedridden and only brother went to work, I wasn't allowed to stay by my bedridden mother and was forced to work. They only yelled, "Hojda na robotu," out to work, and one couldn't hear anything else fall from their lips, always the same thing. The holidays I had in Siberia, I will probably never have anything like this. There wasn't even a morsel of bread at home. Only misery and poverty looked into our windows. When I went out to beg, sometimes I brought back a morsel of bread and sometimes not even that. My longing was to put a good morsel of bread into my mouth. When we were riding south, we saw people rumbling about the station and black from hunger. In our oblast, the NKVD building served as the representative building. It served as the propaganda building. We really don't find the words to describe these experiences in Russia. It is impossible either to describe or tell. Only that person can understand it who felt it himself on his own skin. Otherwise, no one will understand. The language of those reports were originally written in Polish, but they were translated in such a way as to mirror the language of the children, because being taken away from school at the age of 10 to 12, whatever they could speak in Polish, they mixed with Russian, and sometimes they forgot about the grammar, and the translator was trying to put that into English. That's why it sounds awkward. So what saved some of the Polish deportees, because we don't really know how many left, but a small percentage was saved by the reinstatation of Polish-Soviet diplomatic relations, which naturally were non-existent the moment the USSR attacked Poland. So the moment Germany attacked USSR, there happened a rapprochement encouraged by the British between the Polish government and the USSR government. Naturally, the fate of the Polish POWs was one of the burning issues in those diplomatic relations, but in let's say a creative discussion that took place, Stalin agreed to the amnesty for the Polish inside who were present inside of the area of USSR, and for the creation of the Polish army in USSR, which was initially to be entirely formed in USSR of Polish soldiers, but after a number of difficulties and obstacles that the Soviets were doing to the Poles in the process of the creation of the army, General Anders, who himself used to be a prisoner in Lubyanka and was freed as a result of this agreement to form the Polish army, decided to evacuate whatever Polish army he managed to assemble by March 1942, and they were evacuated to the British territories outside of the USSR, but on the border, mostly to what is now Iran. And evacuation took place between March and September 1942. However, the amnesty was announced earlier, and as a result, many Poles were able to leave the slave labor in the villages to which they were relocated in 1940 and in 1940 and in 1941. So what it looked like was there was amnesty, but you had to find about it on your own. So the news traveled from village to village, from pole to pole, but oftentimes they would be faced with the opposition of the local authorities that didn't like to lose slave labor. So Poles were forced to sign some documents that they are rescinding Polish citizenship, or that they vowed, that they obliged themselves to work for one more year in this place or other. And in many instances, Poles just had to escape from the places where they were working to be able to somehow travel to the places of concentration of the Polish army in the USSR. And this is one more harrowing story, because people who are destitute are leaving the places where they work, where they are being worked to death, to try to reach the forming Polish army, hoping that in some way they will be able to save themselves. So what was a huge surprise at the beginning for General Anders was the number of civilians that joined the soldiers that he expected to be there. In the end, more than 100,000 people were evacuated, including 36,000 women and children. So more than 1/3 evacuated were women and children. But if we compare it to even the lowest little probable estimate of 340,000 deported, it is still only approximately 10%. So living with Anders' army was a chance to survive, and the fate of Polish children, especially of Polish orphans abroad, is a topic for a separate presentation. There is a very moving book published. There is a very moving book published about the fates of the Polish exiles, but I'm not sure if it was translated into English. So let's go here. The story of the book is curious in itself. The lady who wrote it used to be a great Polish film star and internationally known. Then she was imprisoned by the Germans, then she was imprisoned by the Soviets, and finally when she was freed due to amnesty, she described the fate of the Polish orphans in a book, Exiled Children. And in the other picture you see Maharaja, who was a personal friend of Ignacy Paderewski before the war, and he decided to save Polish children and built a village for children in his estate in India, and persuaded other Indian aristocrats to chip in for the help for the Polish children. So 5,000 children could be helped in this way. You can see the physical condition of children who are leaving the Soviet Union. I would say that those photographs are, the regularity, you can see what they look like. And what I wanted to read now, just to sum up the lecture, is the excerpt from the book about the fates of Polish orphans by Hanka Ordonówna, but also one last excerpt of the family who lived long enough to hear about the amnesty, but you will see what happened to them later. So Hanka Ordonówna writes about the arrival of children into Ashgabat, and she writes the following. Into this Ashgabat night there spilled from the trains a crowd of little paupers, from whom everything had been taken away, including their parents' loving hearts, encased in the bodies, frozen under the faraway snows. A station lamp dangled in the gusts of wind, projecting shades and lights onto exhausted, emaciated faces of children. This tragic lot formed a long procession. The children barely dragged their legs, in pairs, misery with disease, hunger with lice, to the awaiting buses. And the last piece from children's accounts is the account which was very long and probably because it cost this child a lot to write about it. So I chose only the final piece. The gist of the text is that they hear about the amnesty and they prepare themselves to leave the place where they are. So the family is amassing as much dried bread as they can, and mother with one of the children goes for a journey to the neighboring village to sell some of the last possessions that they have to buy more bread, and she freezes on the way. So they hear back that she froze, and the husband has to come back with the body. We all sitting by the stove and saying, how we will live now without Mama? I'm sorry. Well, I won't be able to read it, so I suggest maybe that you read it for yourselves. Unfortunately, can I make it larger? I was hoping I will be able to read this, but I'm sorry, I'm not. So I'll just leave it for you to read. And to sum up the whole problem of the deportations of the Poles is it's a topic worth researching and worth remembering. And I would like to make sure that this small collection of reflections of what the situations of the deportees was stays in your mind and hopefully serves as one more contribution to the evaluation of what the Second World War was like and who was the aggressor in the war and who was the savior in that war. Thank you. Are there any questions? Yeah.
Yes, this is such a timely topic, and especially now. And I also remember reading or mentions of how the children went all over the world. They went to India. Some also went to parts in Africa. And I also wondered if you came across anything in your research that dealt with the scouting movement, because the Polish scouts apparently were active wherever they went. For example, I know in Africa they had a Polish scouting organization that was run.
Oh, I read a very interesting article lately about the restoration of the Polish graves in Africa, in the graves of people who came there as deportees and actually died there because of the overall physical exhaustion. And I remember that in some way the scouting organization was involved in those activities, but I was not particularly focusing on the scouting movement. However, to be able to leave the Soviet Union, the children were joining a paramilitary organization, so to say. There was the paramilitary school of Junacy for boys and of junior military volunteers for girls. And when they managed to enlist with the school, they could be evacuated. This is the way that was found to be able to take them out from the USSR. But I don't really know the details. What is also interesting about the evacuation of children was that after the war, when the place was sought for them, there weren't actually very many countries who were willing to take in Polish deportees. And as far as I remember, New Zealand, some African countries, and Mexico volunteered to take them in, but there wasn't that many countries willing to go against the victorious Soviet Union in this regard. Are there any other questions? Yes, Dr. Turner?
Oh, yes. When I was young, younger, I read a book by a friend of mine at that time. He's deceased now, J.K. Zawadny. You know of him?
Yeah, we spoke about him many times ago.
Yeah, he did a book called Death in the Forest, which brought to the American people the Katyn Forest Massacre. There is no equivalent, as far as I know, to what you have described today. And I wonder why that is the case. Is it the case that there is no expose of this tragedy that's available to the public in the U.S.? Is that right?
You mean the Katyn Forest Massacre?
No, it's something that describes what you talk about. That is equivalent to the book I mentioned.
Well, the book I mentioned, from which the textual evidence in the presentation comes from, is called The War Through Children's Eyes. It was published in the 1980s in Poland. Here, I'm not sure if it was published in America, but at least it is published in English. And this is a review of the accounts of children that were available in the Hoover institution. So the book briefly describes the mechanism of Polish deportation of the Poles and the number of people deported and the political gist of the operations. And then it gives 120 chosen accounts of children's papers that describe the
Okay, it's just stop.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody knows that. Nobody knows that.
That's why I'm talking about this.
Yeah, no, this is what I'm suggesting, Maria. That's your assignment. Thank you very much. That's what you should do.
Yeah.
Last question.
Well, I just wanted to respond to yours. There's a website called Siberia, and some of the people, even the ones from this area, I think, have recorded and written their experiences when they were deported. They were children to Siberia. I don't know I thought that was pretty widely known, but it may not be.
It is not.
Yeah, so
Actually, the rule is that nothing
the last
is really,
question.
nothing
You
is really
mentioned
on-
about Siberia,
Mm.
but my question is,
Oh,
how far east they were sent? I mean,
I think
all the way to, let's say, Kamchatka or,
let's
no,
see
no.
how far.
yeah.
You see the last.
So some people were sent over here.
Yeah, I think the farthest place
That's-
they went to is
that's
Bakoyansk or
right by Kamchatka.
Chita.
Yeah,
Oh, the
that's amazing.
this is actually the place of the where people were sent to Gulag, not really where they were
Yeah.
deported. The deportations are in the striped areas. So the farther they went is here and
Yeah.
here,
Okay,
but also here.
okay.
So on the border with Afghanistan, close to China, close to Mongolia. well, to the places where nobody wanted to live because of their remoteness and harsh living conditions and lack of job opportunities.
Mm.
All right, so it was pleasure to talk to you. I'm sorry my voice failed at the last evidence, but
Oh, dear.
I'm only a human being.